Good evening, everyone. So tonight, my effective practices and assessment is going to be focusing on reading and in the kindergarten classroom. So an overview of what I'll be talking about tonight, I'll first be talking about kindergarten then and now, the history of kindergarten, and then I'll also be talking about the different aspects of assessment in kindergarten, along with the readiness assessment that they have to take, and one specific practice that I love, which are read-alouds. So kindergarten then and now, the bar has been raised for both children and teachers in kindergarten, really high. There are a lot more things that kindergartners are expected to do as well as the teachers. Also, more and more students are enrolled in state-funded kindergarten than ever before. Since 2002, the total enrollment for pre-kindergarten has increased by 73% for 4-year-olds and 45% for 3-year-olds. That's a big jump than what it used to be. Also, the cutoff birth date for kindergarten has moved back, which means that more kindergartners are enrolling than ever before. The curriculum has changed too. It's more teacher-directed instruction rather than hands-on activities where students are socializing and using their imagination and creativity. It's more content-oriented learning where teachers are assessing with worksheets or tests to determine what they have learned, when that wasn't always the case in kindergarten. It's also starting to look more and more like primary grades, but the problem is the kindergartners haven't changed in their social skills or the problem solving or the way they think, which is making it more difficult for kindergartners to understand what's going on and to learn. So assessment doesn't always have to be teach to the test. You can still assess students and keep it joyful and not boring. So assessments can still address the standards and still use developmentally and culturally appropriate practices. So assessment in kindergarten is a continuous process. So students are always being assessed throughout the year. That's very important in kindergartners because you want to learn how they are progressing and how fast or slow they're learning. So students are very unique and they don't all learn at the same rate. So a good way to keep progress of this is in a portfolio. Just make one up for each student and keep their work and tests in there so you can look back and see how they're progressing, what you need to go over, and what you can move on to. So one idea of assessment is observation. Observation is key when you are assessing kindergartners. So you should observe an activity, assess how the student's knowledge of a newly introduced concept is going, and then you can use that assessment to guide your instruction to see what the next step needs to be, if you need to still work on what's being taught or if you can move on. You can also take these assessments that you get from observing to match all their learning styles. So you really can learn a lot by observing and seeing how they learn, so you can take all the learning styles and create lessons that reach each student of yours. Assessment is also a comprehensive process. It can measure many aspects of learning. It doesn't just measure what is being taught in that lesson specifically, but you also learn about how students learn and how they show what they learn, and you learn about their interests and everything else. So like I said, that's all about observation. You really need to do a naturalistic assessment to see how your students learn and how you can use that to make your lessons better and to reach those students. Assessment is also an integrated process. So our learning goals should guide our assessment process. You really want to make sure that your assessments are reaching your students, but also you want to make sure that they're actually going over what needs to be taught and that your students have learned what the standards are stating and what your learning goals are. Children should also be assessed while engaged in the process of learning. So you need to go, like I said, observe your students and see how they are learning while they're doing it, so then you can really get a good grasp of what needs to be done. Teachers can use these assessments as tools to modify the curriculum to meet individual children's strengths and needs, and they can also measure the curriculum effectiveness. So you can take your assessments and say, okay, these students really did not understand what I was doing. Maybe it's not me, but it's the curriculum or how I gave the information to them, so you can take that and change it for the better. So readiness assessments. Readiness assessments are used everywhere, and each state is different, but they all assess what children know and are able to do as they enter into the kindergarten classroom. So teachers, the first day or the first week of school, they bring each kid one-on-one up to them and they ask them questions about all different things such as shapes and letters and vocabulary and numbers, and they really want to get a grasp on what those students know so they know what to work on. These results help provide high quality instruction because the teachers take the results and figure out what they need to work on to reach those specific students in her classroom. So this is very helpful to every teacher out there. So some pros about the readiness assessment. These tests help with many things. They can help you form groups within the class so you know who to group who with. It can really, like if you really know someone's really good at something, but the other person's having a hard time, then you know that you should probably pair those two people together. It also identifies interventions that may be beneficial to some students. So if a student's not understanding anything, then you know, okay, maybe I should do an RTI or see if that student has a learning disability, and then you can really give that student what they need. You also learn about their interests and preferences and their social emotional needs. You learn so much from these assessments. I just think they're awesome. One con that I found pretty interesting is that many teachers think that these readiness tests don't actually measure what is important about those students. So in 1999, this survey was given where over 75% of teachers believe that health and enthusiasm and students' curiosity is way more important than knowing if they know how to count or know their letters in the alphabet, which I found pretty interesting. So teachers are basically saying that these tests don't measure everything that's most important about students. So important tips about the readiness assessments is to make sure that you use them in a natural part of your interaction with your students. This really helps with students not feeling the pressure of an assessment. So you want to just call them up to your desk one-on-one and just start talking to them about other things, and then just see if they'll answer questions about shapes and letters. I see my kindergarten teacher do this in her classroom that I'm doing my practicum in all the time, and all the students feel so comfortable when they're up at her desk because they just know that she's a friend more than a teacher, and they feel comfortable answering all of her questions. So another tip is to make sure that you do these frequently. You have to make sure that this test is given multiple times throughout the year so you really know what your students know or how they're progressing so you can figure out what you need to do to help them. It's also important to get feedback from their other teachers, such as gym teachers and music teachers, because the students in their classes may show different ways of showing what they know to them rather than you, because they may feel comfortable maybe with them and not you. So you just really need that communication with the other teachers to make sure that you understand your students better. So read alouds. Read alouds I find to be a very effective assessment practice in the kindergarten classroom. Kindergarten classrooms are hard for pen and paper assessments, so I think read alouds are a great way to understand how students are understanding texts and books that they read. So research has shown that the most effective read alouds are ones where students aren't just listening to someone read the book to them, but they're also participating and asking and answering questions, as well as making predictions. So you aren't just reading a book, but every page you're stopping and asking a student a question about the book, about either recalling an event or about how it relates to them. So it's important to not only have them talk, but you want them to ask questions and make predictions and make inferences about that text. So I know in my kindergarten class, we have them turn and talk to a neighbor, and they get to talk with each other about certain questions or statements about the book, and they really enjoy it, and it really helps students understand what they are reading. Also, in these read alouds, you have students go over vocabulary and definitions. So you really want to encourage them to use that vocabulary and definitions that they're learning in answering their questions. You want them to get used to that vocabulary so they know how to use it from then on. So just a couple things to remember for read alouds is to keep the lessons short. A lot of kindergartners have short attention spans, so it's important to keep it short. I would say 15 to 20 minutes max, because if you go any past that, then the students are not paying attention, or you're not using your time wisely. So you also want to make sure that you're including all students during your read aloud, because you don't want to keep calling on the same students over and over, because then you don't know if you're reaching the other students that aren't being called on. So just make sure that you're including everyone in your read aloud and answering the questions. It's also important to ask important questions that make students think, and not just random questions that don't really have to do with understanding the text. You really want to get those deeper level thinking questions out there to have those kindergartners practice that. So like I said before, a joyful kindergarten class does not mean that standards are not being met. You can still have an enjoyable and joyful learning environment and still have a developmentally appropriate teaching lesson. As long as you use your students' interest in your lessons, then your class can be very joyful, and also it can reach all students as well as all the standards that are needing to be met. Appropriate assessment can lead to joyful learning and joyful teaching. So here are my references, and thank you for listening.